program Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, here on American History TV.
Next on American History TV, military historian Geoff Babb argues the Chinese Communist movement was largely a consequence of World War I. Born in May of 1919 with student movements over several issues, including what they saw as unfair terms and imperial bias in the Treaty of Versailles. In this talk, Babb traces the history and the unintended consequences of Western influence up until the 1949 founding of Communist China. The National World War I Museum and Memorial hosted this event and provided the video.
We have the pleasure of welcoming back to our auditorium Dr. Geoff Babb for a lecture on World War I and the birth of Communist China. And we're proudly presenting this as part of our Pershing Lecture Series, which we do so in partnership with the General Command and Staff College Department of Military History. We'll have another lecture in December and continue into 2021, so we hope that you continue to stay tuned. For our lecture this evening, it will run 45 minutes, and whether you are watching on YouTube or you are watching on Facebook Live, we hope that you are encouraged to ask questions, and unlike being here in the auditorium, you can actually ask them during our presentation, and once Dr. Babb wraps up, we will ask him those. So hope you are feeling creative tonight. It is now my pleasure to officially introduce Dr. Geoff Babb. Dr. Joseph G.D. Babb is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel, currently serving as an Associate Professor of History at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College. Dr. Babb served as a China Foreign Officer, where he studied in Hong Kong and Beijing and in Washington, D.C. at the Defense Intelligence Agency and on the Joint Staff. He has written on the American military's role in China in volumes 1 and 2 of Through the Joint, Intra-Agency, and Multinational Lens, Perspectives on the Operational Environment, and, most recently, wrote a chapter on the Korea War in Weaving the Tangled Web, Military Deception in Large-Scale Combat Operations. Folks, please help me from home, wherever you're tuning here. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Geoff Babb.
Thanks very much, Camille. I sure appreciate it. It's nice to be back. It's nice to be not doing this presentation from behind my desk. These two gentlemen, Mr. Li and Mr. Chen, are noted as the founders of communism in China. And I'll have another slide later on that will talk a little bit more about them. They're both intellectuals, and they both did not make it to see their work come to fruition. I'd like to start by going backwards just a little bit. And in a translation of Mao and Guerrilla War by Samuel B. Griffith III, Brigadier General, United States Marine Corps, retired, he has a chapter on history. And in that history, he talks about the precursors of People's War. And I'll mention these three quite briefly. On the left side of the screen, it's the San Yuan Li. These were people who rose up against the British when the British went on ground inland in Guangzhou during the Opium War. And if you go to Guangzhou today, there's a little museum to the San Yuan Li. What you see in China today in many places are really, really well-done museums that are meant to emphasize nationalism in China. And the one in Guangzhou is especially a nice little museum. At the bottom right, you see Hong Shui-chuan of Hong Shui-chuan, the head of the Taiping Rebellion. Between 1854 and 1864, as many as 20 million Chinese people died in that war. Now, if you think about that as about the same time in the United States we're having our Civil War, this was, for all intents and purposes, a civil war. Hong was a very interesting man. He decided after, well, one of the accounts is that he, after failing his civil service exam the fourth time, he had a nervous breakdown. And during that breakdown, he had a vision. And that vision came out of some of the Baptist tracts that he was reading that he'd picked up in Hong Kong, and he believed he was Jesus Christ's younger brother. Gathered around him a large group of people and began to move north to take down the government in Beijing. And he and his forces came very close to doing that. And almost nobody's ever heard of it. Jonathan Spence, the noted China scholar at Yale, has a book called God's Chinese Son, and it's about Hong. And of course, the nice picture up north is, it has this multinational nature here, the Boxer Rebellion. And so all three of these stories appear in very short blurbs in Mao Zedong's book on guerrilla war. The international occupation, humiliation, and birth of communism in China are related. Today, Xi Jinping has talked about the century of humiliation, 100 years of humiliation. And again, if the United States military, while the United States Army is going to move overseas, some of the best regiments in the United States Army are in Asia and stay in Asia through World War I. So beginning in 1900, all the way through 1938, there are U.S. Army units that are on the ground there. And there's a wonderful little book that talks about the four major regiments that were there, 9th, 14th, 15th, and 31st Infantries. There are also cavalry and artillery units that are there as well. Now on more to China. In 1905, there are thousands of Chinese students studying in Japan. And Japan is hosting them for their own political and diplomatic purposes. And one of the people that is being hosted is Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is from southern China, just north of Macau, which is not far from Hong Kong. And they began a revolutionary alliance, the Tongminhui. And it is an amalgamation of various groups that oppose the Qing government and want the Qing government removed. Within a decade, the Qing dynasty, which is the last of China's dynasties. So, first one being the Qin in 221 BC, all the way through 1911, China is ruled by dynasties. There are periods between some of the dynasties where there's a lot of chaos, where the political power rests in several places at the same time. The Three Kingdoms period, the Northern Song and the Southern Song. But in the end, there's a pretty continuous dynastic rule in China. It ends in 1911. And so you see the picture of the Emperor Dowager, Cixi, the last emperor, Puyi. Now, the uniform that he's wearing there is when he is used by the Japanese as the puppet up in Manchuria, Manchukuo. But this is less of a revolution than it is a crumbling. China just falls apart. The soldiers that began this uprising in Wuchang didn't really have in their head taking over all of China. It just fell apart. And if you notice on this map, both Mongolia and Tibet are independent. So when you look at Mongolia today, and especially when you look at Tibet today, this is the last time they look back and see themselves as independent nations. And China was so weak that it could not do anything about Mongolia and Tibet. And that land in between those two places is Xinjiang, where the problem that the Chinese are having with the Uyghurs exists today. Sun Yat-sen is a politician. He's a medical doctor. And he has not put together a military backup. So Yuan Shikai, who had been a general in the Qing dynasty's army and had his own army, the Beiyang army, basically stepped in, pushed Sun Yat-sen aside, and begins a military dictatorship. He actually tries to start a new dynasty. But in 1916, he is dead. There's an argument that he was poisoned, but he's no longer the ruler. Back up a couple of years to 1914, and this is when the Japanese, with their British allies, take on the German concession at Qingdao. The Chinese asked to take part, wanted to take part, and really wanted, once the Germans were kicked out of Shandong, to take it over themselves. But the Japanese, and you can see from the numbers of forces they put on the ground, were not fooling around. They were going to take it, they were going to hold it. That gave them land in a very important place in China. The Shandong Peninsula, if you just go inland, you'll come to Chufu, the home of Confucius, and the mountain of Taishan, the holy mountain that Confucius, holy being not exactly the correct word, since Confucianism is not a religion. But this province is very, very important to China. It is fundamental to China. And so this Shandong province problem is going to reemerge in 1919. In January 2015, while Yuan Shikai is still the leader of China, the Japanese make the famous 21 demands. These 21 demands are in 5 groups, and they are all worded in such a way, meaningful in such a way, that Chinese sovereignty will be diminished. Now, today, the Chinese talk about sovereignty. Sovereignty in the South China Sea, sovereignty over the other areas that they control. Tibet, Xinjiang being 2. Sovereignty is a big deal for the Chinese. And this was a prime example of another nation trying to exert sovereignty. Now, the United States had put in place the open door policy back in 1900 under the McKinley administration with the Secretary of State John Hay. But at the end of the day, the Japanese took advantage of their time, and they tried to get these demands met. Yuan Shikai stopped it for a while, but in the end, the top 4 of these were pretty much done. But the last one did not go. So when the Chinese go to the Treaty of Versailles, they have an issue foremost to get fixed, and it has to do with Japan. Did the Chinese fight in the war? No. What the Chinese did do in the war is provide laborers. So Britain and France recruited Chinese laborers, and they weren't in there getting the serfs. They weren't in there getting the peasants. They got solid workers. They were checked for their health, they were checked for their hardiness, and they picked very good people to be part of this group. The Russians got over 200,000 Chinese laborers. Now that would seem a little bit odd, but the loss of manpower for the European nations was was extreme. One of the French transports sunk and over 500 Chinese died. Most returned to China in 1918 to 1920 of the ones that were in Europe. The ones that were in Russia, records are not so good on. The other interesting thing is they were paid as contract labor. And when they were mistreated, which would indicate that there was some organization and some education in the Chinese that went to Europe as laborers. And so this was an important piece of also being part of the Allies and what was going to go on at Versailles. So on the 14th of August, 1917, the Chinese joined the Allies. And the map that's on here, I just, like everything else you find online, I thought was magic. And so you can, from this map, see the names of the oceans and the countries. And I think it's what Taiping Yang is interesting because it's the Pacific Ocean. I'm sorry, you can also see on the top row the Chinese flag is in the middle on the right. So, the Shandong controversy, which I've talked about. The Chinese sent 2 representatives to Versailles. The most well-known one is this gentleman, Wellington Koo. Obviously a great Chinese name. And so they brought up the outrage of Article 156, which essentially allowed Japan to keep control and, for all intents and purposes, sovereignty over the Shandong Peninsula, Qingdao. And they certainly had the ground military forces there on the ground to do that. This precipitated the May 4th movement. And as this indicates, the Chinese never signed the Treaty of Versailles. So what's the May 4th movement? And I've got a series of slides here to try to talk a little bit about the various aspects of it, because it is one of the most important activities in the birth of the Communist Party. So the first thing it does is it accentuates Chinese nationalism. The youth of China are outraged at how their government has failed them at Versailles. And they're absolutely beside themselves about the continued occupation of their country by Japan. So out in the streets they go. Now what's interesting, what happened in 1919 comes back again with the same words in 1966 during the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution. And the other thing that you might notice is in May of 1989 is when the Tiananmen Square incident really gets rolling. And the Chinese government will not come in till June. But arguably, the Chinese government was scared to death, and I would argue right now is scared to death of the students. And so the students in the streets of May 4th, 1919, 70 years later, send a shockwave through the Communist Party of China, and they deliberated what to do. And the first thing they did was send down Zhao Ziyang to try to talk to the students and get them peacefully to leave the square. When that failed, Li Peng, the butcher of Beijing, under the direction of Deng Xiaoping, who we'll talk about in a minute, ordered the square cleared. And the number of dead is unknown. From the Chinese party perspective, they've never admitted that any Chinese students or demonstrators died. They claimed the deaths were all to their valiant soldiers fighting this anti-revolutionary movement. So, what were the students doing? 13 different universities, and these 5 are their demands. So hopefully everybody can read that, so I'll let you read through them. Notice, Shandong, the number 1 issue. And number 5 on this is the Treaty of Versailles. So the students got together, and this was what they were demonstrating about. Interestingly, the major reforms of universities. We don't tend to think about it, but who's going to go to university during the time of the dynasties, especially the Qing dynasty? The national exam went away with until 1905-06. So people were still taking these exams where they were basically writing the 8-legged essays of trying to analyze what Confucius had said. Now, the students are ready for a Western education. The students are ready for the sciences. The students are ready for all these other opportunities to happen. So it has only been a decade before where what we would call a modern education has really begun. And you can notice here that the president of Beijing University is a graduate of Columbia University. And so the movement towards a more Western style education is also a problem for the governing leaders of China. It's cultural. Probably the most famous novel in China is Q by Lu Xun. And I'll show you another slide in a minute about the importance of Lu Xun to the Chinese. The other thing is Bai Hua, vernacular Chinese. There was an attempt to get literature out to the people. To get literature out to the people, it had to stop being written in the classic manner. And so the idea here is to write magazines and books that can be read as normal novels, like we would in the West. You didn't have to read them in a foreign language, which was ancient Chinese. And one of the big issues here was the repudiation of Confucianism. And that is going to be a theme throughout Mao's reign, because Confucianism was seen as anti-egalitarian. It was based on a set of superior and inferior relationships. And so it was one of the targets. Boycott of Japanese goods. The students understood who the problem was. The problem was twofold. The problem was the Japanese, and the problem was governments in China that were too weak to oppose it. And that weakness came from warlordism. There was a government in Beijing, but it was very weak. Yuan Shikai had been a strong leader, but with his death in 1916, what came afterwards was weak. And again, the overreaction, the beating of the students, the arrests. So what you saw, all right, it's Hong Kong in 2019, 2020. Students in the street are a problem for the government of China, for the CCP, and they were for the weak government in Beijing, the Beiyang government. In 1939, as it says on here, Mao wrote that the May 4th movement was a stage in the communist road in China. And he calls the working class, the student masses, and the new bourgeoisie the pillars of communism in China. Mao's second, from the mid-30s until they died in 1976, during the same year, was this guy, Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai, like Deng Xiaoping, went from China to Europe right after the First World War. And so he is a founding member of the party. And he's part of the intellectual elite from China that went to school in Europe. And you can see from the wonderful picture on your left, this is a westernized bunch. You're going to see other pictures where they go back and dress in a more traditional Chinese way. But these young students going to Europe were of the European culture. And the European culture at the time had a lot of socialist and communist leanings. So the Communist International is founded in 1919, and Zhou Enlai shows up in 1920, and off they go. The other is Deng Xiaoping. Now, Deng Xiaoping, after a short interregnum in 1976 to 78, will take over China. He's the second leader for all intents and purposes. And so from 1978 through 1974, Deng Xiaoping is the paramount leader. And you can see what his European story is. Now, there are people that say today that Xi Jinping is the strongest ruler in China since Mao. The interesting thing will be why it's Mao and not Deng. Deng was known for the economic reforms. So that leaves the question of what Xi Jinping wants to be known for. He's not doing the economic reforms, it's doing the political reforms, which is one of the issues that we have today with the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party. So he travels to France to study Marxism and then goes to a unique university in Moscow. One of his classmates was Chiang Kai-shek's oldest son. Now, this will bring us to then the two founders of the Chinese Communist Party. So in July of 1921, a professor at Beijing University, and you can remember that as back as one of the leading universities in the May 4th movement, and then a veteran revolutionary. So here you have the intellectual with the party organizer. Li Dajiao is executed in 27. Chen Duxiu lasts a little bit longer, but he's imprisoned in 32. They are taken out. However, they're also replaced. So in July of 1921, at the building that you see in the top left, which you can go to today in Shanghai, is where the first meeting of the Chinese Communist Party was held. Now, the interesting picture is the boat at the bottom, because there appeared to be a movement to stop this in the city of Shanghai. So the Communist Party leadership moved the meeting to the boat. Now, there are pictures of 12 Chinese on this that were the original 12 delegates. Of these 12, only 2 will see October of 1949. They are the inner revolutionaries of the party, and they will fall by the wayside over time. The rise of Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen learned from the 1911-1912 experience that he had to have a military. And so there's this young officer who had been trained in Japan. He had gone to a military high school in Japan and then was in the Japanese army as an artilleryman for a short period of time, and then came back to China. So this is the young Chiang Kai-shek with Sun Yat-sen. And Sun Yat-sen has 3 policies. An alliance with the Soviet Union. Why? 5 years before, at the Treaty of Versailles, the Western world had turned their back on China. The Shandong problem. And so who was going to support China in the road ahead to independence and to rid itself of the Japanese menace? Well, the best choice was obviously the Soviet Union. And so with Sun Yat-sen, we also see support to the workers' and peasants' movements and collaboration with the Chinese Communist Party. So that party that had had its first convention in Shanghai is now big enough and robust enough to play a major role in what will be the new Chinese government. That's the government of the Kuomintang, the KMT. And notice who gets sent to the Soviet Union to study. We noticed that his son had been sent before. Now he's sent. He will also have a son that goes and studies and becomes a military officer in Germany. When he comes back, with the help of Russian advisors, they will establish the Whampoa Military Academy. It's also called Huangpu. And it's another place that you can go visit. If you go to Guangzhou, you can take a subway line out and then a quick walk, and you're at this exact gate that you see in this picture. It is a tourist site. It also is a Chinese Navy base. So you kind of get to see a few ships normally when you go there. So what we now have being formed in Guangzhou, in the southern part of the country, where the government's base is up in Beijing, an opposition. And that opposition has both communists and nationalists. They're one party working together in the First United Front. Sun Yat-sen dies. The most powerful man in southern China in this movement becomes Chiang Kai-shek. And he's both ruthless and smart and clever. You can see him here with Borodin, one of the Soviet advisors. And the Soviets at Whampoa are putting a lot of political education into the curriculum, as Chiang is building a modern army, a modern officer corps. Chiang is not particularly happy about it, but the Russians are supplying advisors, the Russians are supplying equipment. He'll take it and does take it. Up in Moscow, there's Sun Yat-sen University. It was established in 1925, the year after Whampoa. And both the KMT and the communists are sending students there. And so you see Mao and Wang Ming. And Wang Ming is one of the leaders in what's called the 28 Bolsheviks. Mao never left China until he went to Russia in like February of 1950. You can see Zhang Jingguo, that is his wife, a Bilo-Russian, and their son. And Sun Yat-sen's policy is an alliance with the Soviet Union. And so that's Chiang Kai-shek's policy as well, for a while. Who's the enemy? The enemy is warlords. And there are some great books out there on Chinese warlords and warlordism. And if you grab one, you'll just get confused with the Chinese names and the Chinese places and at the end of the day. So I've only picked two here, and I picked them because it just so happens they are very important and control large tracts of territory. You can also see at the bottom center of the picture, this is the KMT's home ground. This is where their movement is growing from. It's Guangzhou. It's southern China. It's just north of Hong Kong. It's where the volatile revolutionaries come from. Here's the territory of Jiangsu and the territory of Wu Peifu. That area of Changsha to Wuhan is very important to the Chinese. And the Jiangsu Lin area, he is going to be assassinated by the Japanese. His son, Jiang Zuiliang, is going to be part of a movement that will kidnap Chiang Kai-shek in something that's called the Xi'an Incident to try to bring the KMT and the CCP back together again in 1936 to fight the Japanese. Well, why was he so fired up to fight the Japanese? Well, they assassinated his father. So it shows the tenuousness of the political hold that Chiang Kai-shek has on the country, because these are only two of many warlords. And those warlords are Christians, Muslims, animists. They're in it for the money, they're in it for themselves, they're in it for the good of mankind and the Chinese. You name it, there's a warlord who's following it. But in 1927, Chiang mounts a northern expedition. And what you do is divide and conquer. You take on one, and you make alliances with the other, and then you buy off another. And slowly but surely, you make your way up to Nanjing and establish a government. On the way to Nanjing, you decide enough of the communists. I'm done with them. We're not going to deal with this anymore. I'm going to do away with essentially the left side of the Socialist Party of China, which is the CCP. The center of that Socialist Party is the KMT. So Chiang, defying his Soviet advisors, goes after the communists. It is not successful. Mao and many others escape. They go down into what is southeast central China and begin to build. To build what? To build Soviets. The communists survive, the Red Army is born, and the rest is history. In question and answers, I'm happy to talk about 1927 to 49. It wasn't a fait accompli that the communists would win in China. But you can still read today, and depending upon who you read and how you read them, Chiang Kai-shek made a lot of mistakes. The problem was he was given a problem set that nobody could solve. China was broken up, never recovered from the deterioration of the Qing regime, which they call, and we look at now, as the 110 years of humiliation. So when you look at China today and you hear the words, the 100 years of humiliation, that is from 1839, the beginning of the Opium War, to 1949, when the Communist Party of China declares the People's Republic of China. Now, when you hear, there's a book out there now called The 100-Year Marathon. The 100-Year Marathon is when China assumes the position that it historically held as a global leading nation. And so that 100-year marathon, the book by Michael Pillsbury, is from 1949 to 1950. And for the Chinese, it's a make-up for the 110 years of humiliation. And towards the end of that humiliation is the Treaty of Versailles and Article 156, the Shandong problem. This is another interesting piece. Where did communism come in China? It was fractured. It was fractious. It had internecine problems of its own. So in this picture, Bogu, Juda, Zhou Enlai, and Mao, in this picture up in Yan'an. And Yan'an is where Mao was driven by Chiang Kai-shek's army in 1935 at the end of the Long March. And then you get the Xi'an incident of 1936, which happened as the 6th extermination campaign was being planned. And instead of a 6th extermination campaign, you get the Second United Front. But if you look at these pictures, these people with Mao have been trained in Europe. 3 of them have been trained in Europe, and Mao is the lone Chinese who's never traveled outside of the country. And in the poster that you see, this is a poster from 1974, towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. And the picture of the man looking over the student, the worker, and the PLA soldier is Lu Xun, the author of the most famous novel that was from the 1919 era. So the end of 1919 has not been found in China. You're going to see it emerge again. And there are some classic pieces to look at. Fear of students. Fear of demonstrations. The power of individuals to bring political change. It's in their history. And it all happens accelerated by foreign powers and foreign influence. So when one looks at what the Chinese Communist Party is doing today in terms of sovereignty, one can look at it as aggressive, offensive behavior, or setting up a layered defense from what they learned over those 100 years of humiliation. So it may not make much sense to us, but it certainly does to them. So the birth of communist China, I'm arguing, is May 1919 to the First Party Congress. The political animus is made. And then you get the vagaries of war and revolution. And it certainly could have gone any way. There's a wonderful article I give my students to read that talks about the 10 different definitions of the Chinese Revolution. And when you're done, you're going, So any one of these things could have changed the fate of the Communist Party of China and the establishment of the Chinese Communist, the People's Republic of China. But at the end, we're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party today, and we can basically understand it better, or we can just basically pound our way into strategies that may or may not work if we don't fully understand where the other side is coming from. And that's one of the things that we try to teach the students at the Command and General Staff College, which is you've got to look at both sides of the issue. And you've got to understand the enemy, which is straight out of Sun Tzu. Know the enemy, know yourself. There's a big argument out there that we very seldom know the enemy in a deep enough manner to make the key strategic decisions and plans and policies that we need to make. So with that, I should have stirred somebody up, and I should have some questions. So, Camille.
That you do, Geoff. As a reminder for everyone watching, whether that's through our Facebook live stream or through our YouTube stream, thank you for all of you who have submitted questions, and if you haven't, please feel free to do so in the comments section. So our first question here. How is Chinese communism different from Soviet communism? Is it due to ideology, cultural difference, something else?
Yes. As I tried to point out, Chinese communism is an amalgam of different forms of socialism and communism that were emerging in Europe. But it was melded in such a way to fit the Chinese circumstance. And that's sort of reminiscent of the Taiping Rebellion, where this young man basically declares himself a king and Jesus Christ's younger brother. The ability to morph an ideology exists. And so I argue that there is a huge difference between the Soviet Union and the way it was born and grew, and the Communist Party of China and the way Communist China grew. And part of it was Stalin was not a big fan of Mao's. And when Mao first traveled outside of China and went up to Russia, up to the Soviet Union, Stalin mistreated him, put him in a dacha and left him to cool his heels, because he knew what Mao needed. And Mao needed military hardware and weapons. So it was a bad relationship from day one. It was a transactional relationship from day one. And they were based on two very different ideas. The rise of the urban proletariat of Marx in Central Europe versus the rise of the peasants. So at its fundamental level, it has a very different basis. Having said that, Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong thought, and the way that it's talked about in China, will tell you it's grafted. And there's the schools they went to in Russia played a large role in the evolution of the Chinese Communist Party.
Our next question.
Shorter answer this time.
Were there any notable figures who resisted the infiltration of communism into China?
Let me take that in which period. There is a constant back and forth in China from 1911 on. So you first have the warlord period where everybody's got a better idea. And then you have the period of the communists versus the nationalists, but they were together twice. And the very interesting thing is we tried to bring them back together in September of 1945. President Truman sent George C. Marshall, arguably the finest military diplomat in American history, to China to try to bring the communists and the nationalists together. And he stayed there for over a year trying to make this happen. So there was a belief, even in the 40s, that China was fixable. But what underlined it, I would argue, is more historical. So I'll let it go at that, and we'll work it. We'll work it.
Our next question. What would you say is the most influential reason for the failure of the KMT?
Chiang Kai-shek would be the panda hugger in me. The more, I think, reasonable answer to that is there's some problems that just don't get solved. He could not solve all the problems of China. And the communists were able to sabotage his attempts at political change, at economic change, in social change. And so the answer is Chiang Kai-shek, but the real answer is there's nobody else that could have done any better. It was going to happen. I'm not saying it's inevitable, but there were so many problems in China, and the communists just made them worse, and they kept offering hope. At the end of the day, it's hope. And the communists promised hope, and Chiang Kai-shek promised a top-down, nobles-led, arguably more dynastic-like government. And it was time for change. And I can be disputed by at least 100 scholars on that.
What books do you recommend for beginners about China in regards to your lecture?
The next slide. The first one is the May 4th movement, which is a classic that every Chinese graduate student would read. I'm a huge fan of John King Fairbank. He died, I think, early 1990s. But the Great Chinese Revolution is a wonderful book. And then China in Distress by Sheridan is older, but in some ways it's easier to read than some of the new stuff that gets very political. Now, the best book on the era, 1911 to 1949, is by this woman, Sally Payne. She teaches at the Navy War College up in Newport, and she's brilliant. Her husband, Bruce Ellman, also teaches up there and is also a China scholar. So they do great work on China. So if somebody said, what book should I read? It's the two ends. Read the May 4th movement, and then read the Wars for Asia. Those two would be a great place to start.
How did the birth of communist China impact China's current relations with Taiwan?
That's a great question. I don't want to go through the history of Taiwan to see when it was part of China. But during the Ming Dynasty, at the end of the Ming Dynasty, some of the Ming leaders escaped to Taiwan. So Taiwan is an anomaly. It is the last remaining territory that was not brought under control by the communists before they declared the People's Republic of China. So from their perspective, it is a thorn in their side. It is the incompleteness of gaining and maintaining Chinese territory. Hong Kong being the other one that they got back in 97 with the 50-year deal. So right now you're seeing a big upswing in American support for Taiwan. MacArthur thought it was the unsinkable aircraft carrier. It's 25 million people in a place the size of Indiana. If the Chinese military continues at its current rate to improve its military, and we're the only people that are willing to sell weapon systems to Taiwan, there's a certain inevitability about some sort of reintegration. Now again, the panda huggers, the liberals, basically were thinking as China progressed economically, it would liberalize politically, and that just flat hasn't happened. And so the Chinese are getting more harsh and hard about it. So the question is, back out. Do you want to go to war with 1/5 of mankind to save Indiana full of Chinese people? So the question's yours to answer, because you may have to answer it one day, unfortunately.
Our next question. Did the Tong Menghui, and I know I've pronounced that incorrectly, so all folks watching at home, my sincerest apologies, have any plans for a post-revolution China, or was their goal only the removal of the Qing dynasty?
No, and I forget if you pick up a book on Sun Yat-sen, Sun Yat-sen was a medical doctor. Sun Yat-sen went to high school in Hawaii, and is a very, very interesting man. The idea was socialism. Well, and I would argue the idea was that the people of China had to be educated and had to be bored. In 1910, less than 5% of the people in China were literate. So if you have studied in Europe and the United States, the idea that to have a democracy you have to have literate people who can read, can understand the political machinations going on around them. So the idea was to have a period where the Chinese people would be brought along, and eventually they would be given democracy, or a socialist democracy. I'll try to remember right now. There are 3 tenets of Sun Yat-sen's socialism, and the last one is the people's livelihood, which is normally translated socialism. No, so the best that we could hope for was a socialism. But the best we could hope for under Chiang Kai-shek was a dictatorship of the rich that would follow Sun Yat-sen to a certain degree. If you look at the family of Sun Yat-sen, and Chiang Kai-shek, they married sisters. One sister was Chiang Kai-shek's wife, Madam Chiang. The other sister stayed in China and was a great communist. So it was a family divided.
Was Mao's ideology shaped at all by the conflict with Japan?
Supposedly, as a young man, he was in a militia that actually fought in the 1894-95 time frame. I'm not sure he ever fought the Japanese. I believe that the problem of Japan drove a lot, but arguably, Mao would say, thank God for the Japanese. They allowed my victory. Because the Japanese and what they did to China under Chiang Kai-shek so weakened Chiang Kai-shek militarily, economically, that was a big part of his ability to come back. So it's certainly one of the pillars is Japan. And if somebody is smiling at Japan, it's Mao, not Chiang.
There are a lot of Chinese fighters in the Russian Civil War. Did they play any role in forming the Chinese Communist Party?
I did not run across that in any of the readings that I did for this. What you see in the Siberian expedition that I've talked about earlier here were basically warlords from the Northeast, Manchurians, and they would fight on either side that paid them. So if somebody said, hey, this group fought, I would not be surprised. They were going to the highest bidder, and there was enough. Manchuria is the land of the Manchus. It's, I'll say this unnicely for somebody in Montana. It's Montana. Just leave it alone. It'll just live its own way. Let it go. Except, unfortunately, it has a great port system and a great rail line system that the Japanese and the Russians both coveted, and the Chinese couldn't do anything about. So, yes, it's important.
And lastly, for our educators at home, what article do you assign students on the 10 elements of Chinese Revolution?
I knew that was going to be asked. It's a professor at that was at UC San Diego, and I think if you just Google like 10 reasons for the Chinese Revolution, you'll come up with it. I'm finally drawing a blank. Sorry. It'll come back to me the minute I'm in my car.
And what we can do is put that both into the comment section of Facebook Live and for our YouTube stream.
When I go back to my office, I'll grab it off my desk.
All right, well, that wraps up our program for this evening, folks. Thanks you for tuning in, whether you did that through our YouTube stream or on Facebook Live. We are thrilled you decided to spend your evening for us. So a round of applause for Dr. Geoff Babb.